I thought we could start by first maybe exploring why the Liberals have signed this deal and why they've done that now, and their strategy behind it. Elle or anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense for the Liberals. Like, they secure the vote. They don't have to worry, as Pam said, about every vote being a vote of confidence, everything being overthrown the Liberals. It's not clear what the NDP think they're getting out of this. I mean, it's pragmatic for the centre, but one tries to imagine what the NDP slogan is going to be at the next election. Like, we put the buddy into budget. Like how do you then, advocate? Right, then what are you going to go and say to NDP voters? Like, vote for us. We're different from the Liberals, except we committed to vote with the Liberals on everything. So we're not actually different from the Liberals, but you should vote for us anyway. I mean, the NDP supported, Wet'suwet'en, like not the people, like the actual incursions into Wet'suwet'en. They've been very disappointing there. They've been consistently disappointing. Like the Emergencies Act, they had no principled opposition to that. Like during debate, thinking about what that actually means. In Canada, they voted along with that. And of course, the excuse has been, well, we don't want the government to be overthrown. What is that? Because what can we point to that the NDP have actually even done in the last few years to challenge the Liberals to actually have any kind of difference? So in some ways, I suppose, yeah, I mean, it just makes clear what's always existed. The NDP are the Liberal light, and they're just like admitting it and going along with that. But then it's hard to see what that offers for anybody who actually votes NDP. The lane is now open for the Greens, but we know they're a mess and they're not going to come into that lane. So as I said, it really leaves the question of, at the same time as we're doing this pretense that, the Liberals have gone left, and this is like, a socialist coup in Canada. In fact, the reality is it's a centrist coup, and it's absolutely left nowhere else for people to go.
I mean, somebody asked Jagmeet Singh yesterday if the deal could benefit the Liberals instead of the NDP. And he said, well, people might say someone else did it, but frankly, I don't care. I want this to be done because I think it's good for people. I mean, he's even admitting that this isn't necessarily going to benefit the party at the polls or in terms of popularity. So, Martin, I wanted to ask you, what is the strategy here? I mean, maybe I can ask you the question about the Liberal strategy as well, but also then the NDP strategy.
Well, I think one of the probably the best ways to understand this deal is as a pact signed between Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau, but serving both of their interests and serving the kind of institutional needs of both of their parties. So I think Elle is exactly right that this is a strategic coup for the Liberals. They're the ones who come out, I think, probably just thrilled by this. Justin Trudeau's leadership was in question after the last election. There was all kinds of talk about, how soon the transition to a new leader would happen, whether Chrystia Freeland or someone like Mark Carney. And I think this has basically put that in formaldehyde. It ensures that he has 3-4 years to establish a legacy. That's what the media are talking about. But that basically solves any kind of internal challenge to his party. So he must be thrilled. They basically managed to nullify whatever genuine leverage the NDP would have as an opposition party over the coming years. And in order to do that, they have to make relatively low-cost concessions that I think they might have wanted to make anyways. A pharmacare plan basically, brought in slow enough that Big Pharma won't be upset. Probably we're talking over 10 to 12 year range, sometime in the early 2030s. And, a dental care plan that is not going to also cost them very much. So I think the Liberals have come out of it extremely well. And I think the kind of operative principle of Liberal statecraft, which is, things will have to change in order for them to remain the same, is basically at work here as well. The kind of politics are summed up in the mantra that Jagmeet and some of his closest advisors repeat regularly, which is that we're in Parliament to get things done for people, And another one of his favorite lines is Trudeau says the right things, but he doesn't follow through.
Nice things.
He says nice things, but he doesn't follow through. And I mean, that to me seems like a reduction of the mission of the NDP to simply being a more honest and effective practitioner of the politics of the Liberal Party. Basically kind of like a taskmaster liberalism, you know, like we're going to do a better job than the Liberals. And I think it's basically the party is bereft of any kind of real like animating vision these days that would anchor its oppositional work in an alternative vision of society, a society that's governed by values of cooperation and solidarity rather than, you know, competition and profit. So this to me in some ways is a kind of culmination of that politics.
Pam, I'm curious what you think about the NDP strategy too. I mean, what we've been hearing so far is that this deal basically takes away most or any leverage that the NDP had left in Parliament. Elle mentioned, for example, the military spending. Like the NDP's already said, they're not going to oppose increases in military spending as long as this deal is upheld by the Liberals. What do you think of their strategy here?
I think it's pretty much a concession speech, really. I mean, where have the NDP been since the election? You hear from them so rarely. You don't see the leader out there. You don't see the NDP MPs out there making news, challenging issues, advocating for issues that are important. I mean, they've all but disappeared. I mean, this is the most amount of media or speaking that I've seen them do in a very long time. So to me, it just kind of sounded like a concession speech, and it doesn't put them any worse off than they were. They weren't really doing anything, which is unfortunate, but that's the status. And now they're attached to this agreement, and they're not going to oppose anything, and what they're agreeing to isn't really off from what was happening anyway. So I just don't think it's that significant, except for the singular, we're not going to have to worry about a confidence vote every time, and the Conservatives trying to make a mess of everything, whether it's good or bad. From a Liberal perspective, fantastic. They get to proceed with what they want to do. They don't have to worry about a non-confidence vote. And they didn't really have to give up too much. I mean, had the NDP said, listen, you need to close down the Trans Mountain Pipeline and I will support you for the next 3 years. Wow. There are certain segments in society who would rather the government focus on what the needs are right now. So the healthcare crisis, all of our workers that we considered essential workers, what are we doing for them now? What are we going to do for them now? What are we doing for the homeless? Can we refocus back on the skyrocketing incarceration rates for Indigenous peoples? Can we focus on decarceration? Can we talk about community supports? Can we talk about paying teachers properly and fair wages? Like, we need to get back to business instead of it all being about them. That's not what a government's supposed to be. It's supposed to be about the people, and it's just been a horrendous charade of just all about them for a while, and I hope that this stops that.
I think it was Desmond Cole said it's like, Trudeau's sunning Jagmeet Singh, right? Like, they're there, you know what I mean? Like, and then allowing yourself to be put in that position. So I suppose we're supposed to see this as pragmatic. If I had to guess, I think the NDP is trying to play this like, let's move beyond politics, we're above the small, petty things, we're focused on the bigger vision. Except that's not really what we mean when we say move beyond, when we're like, politicians are too focused on petty things, we mean stuff like, ridiculous arguments for performance purposes in Parliament. We don't mean actually making policy for the people. And the NDP, yes, let's move beyond being on TikTok or whatever you're doing, and let's actually, get a reasonable healthcare pension, plans for workers, actual movement on child poverty in this country. Can we get some water to reserves? Maybe, that would be good. If everybody had clean water, that's what we mean when we say get to work. It completely also concedes the ability to say the government isn't doing anything for workers. The government isn't doing anything for the working class. If you live in a rural region, the government doesn't care about you, which is traditionally supposed to be an NDP base. But how can you go out on campaign in the NDP and you're like, the government isn't doing this, and you're like, but you're with the government, and you're like, shoot. You know what I mean?
I mean, I guess one thing we shouldn't lose sight of is as we narrow in on dissecting, the evident failings of the NDP strategy, I think it's still in terms of social movements and the terrain that we have to operate on over the next 3-4 years is that we are contending with a minority. And we're not dealing with a liberal majority, which is always much harder to extract any kinds of concessions from. So despite the NDP's thoroughly lackluster ability to leverage this deal and the minority in general, I think it's still important that the NDP, rather than someone else, holds the balance of power. And in terms of stability, I know people have been trumpeting in the media the value of stability, but I think probably the most useful sense in which we have a stable terrain now is that we have very clear, stable targets for organizing and for campaigning and for trying to extract something. So even if the NDP has kind of like self-owned and disabled its ability to have anything, have a kind of continuous leverage, I think the terrain for us, popular progressive movements, is much better now than it was a year ago.